I'm going to put my cards on the table. It's all right, get ready. We had a lot of groaners the first service here. It's always a pleasure for me to be here, partly because this is one of my spiritual homes in the Pacific Northwest. And many of you know of my long history here. I've outlived many ministers. One of the difficulties with titling a talk way before you get to the talk is that, oh, you know what I was going to do? I was going to trade hats. But everybody should know that this is here. Last year I was wearing it and the Seahawks won the championship. So I started wearing it at the beginning of the season and I thought it wasn't working. But I persisted and it's working again. So as I was saying, you know, we make titles and topics of what we're talking about and then things happen in the world. And sometimes the things that happen in the world need to be talked about. We've come through a rough week. There are a lot of very, very angry people. And ultimately, angry people create violence. Angry people create violence physically, emotionally, mentally, even spiritually, twisting deep spiritual teachings for their own purposes. Certainly the situation for the Jewish community in France is increasingly tense. And the pull is toward polarization. The pull is to identify the bad guys and destroy them. But it won't work. Because ultimately the bad guys are human too. And although we condemn their actions, they carry within them the same life and the same light and the same consciousness that awakens within each and every one of us. And mostly out of lives of desperation, the experience of powerlessness, people find power in the pursuit of extremes. They find identity within groups. You know that the fastest way to create cohesiveness in any group is to unite against a common enemy. That's always worked in the past and it still works. And the universe yearns for those of us who catch ourselves when our ego response is formed by the polarizing energies of our media. Catch ourselves and go, you know, the polarization's not going to help. at some point we have to acknowledge that we are all capable of acts of incredible kindness, and we are all capable of acts of incredible violence. And when we recognize what ignites our own desires for revenge, for hurting another, for isolating another, for removing another, then maybe we can understand in a more healing way what so many in our world are experiencing. But it turns out that what I was going to talk about today fits perfectly. I mean, you probably guessed that. We're approaching the part in the Torah readings, you know, the readings of the 5 books that begin the Hebrew Bible. We read through them every year. And if all we find in them this year is what we found in them last year, it's a reflection of our lack of growing. Spiritual literature is like the spiritual beings through whom that literature expressed. And the spiritual beings have unlimited levels of transcendence. It's like anytime we think we're through, we're stuck. And each level of transcendence is a surprise. You know, until we're there, and then we go, it's obvious. So we're getting to the point in the Torah readings where we're about to receive the 10 Commandments. Rabbinic tradition holds that they were offered actually to all the other peoples populating the earth at that time. You know, because the question was, why did God give it to the Hebrew people? So the rabbinic story is that God offered it to every people who asked what was in it. And when they were told what's in it, they said, that's not something we're interested in. Stealing is part of our way of life. Killing is part of our way of, whatever it was. It didn't match with those things. So he finally went to the Hebrew people out of desperation. He couldn't find anybody else. He said, I have commandments. They said, how much do they cost? He said, they're free. They said, we'll take 10. Actually, that's not true. He offered it to the Hebrew people, and the rabbinic legend is the people said, Na'aseh v'nishma, we'll do it and we'll listen. Just an acceptance. So what was happening at Sinai? Another name for Sinai is Horeb. And something already happened at Horeb well before the delivery of those commandments. Incidentally, in the Bible, they're not called commandments. And we've gotten so used to hearing them translated as commandments, it's hard to get that it's not necessary to translate that Hebrew as command. You could translate that Hebrew as statements. Sometimes what I think those commandments or those principles are, it's like an operating manual for this level of reality. We awaken in some kind of spaceship and a clearing, we get out and there's a plaque. And it says, okay, if you want to know how things work on this level, read this. This is how it works. You violate this stuff, your life is not going to work. You follow this stuff, that's the way things operate. But Moses was, in the Torah, they are referred to as Aseret HaDvarim, 10 davars, 10 Davar is an interesting word. It means both word and thing. It was called Ancient New Thought Judaism. Aseret HaDevarim, 10 principles, 10 statements about reality, not commandments. Do you know that they're numbered differently in Jewish tradition, in Catholic tradition, and in Protestant tradition? Because they don't, in the Torah, they don't come numbered. In Jewish tradition, the first one is seen as, I am the eternal one, your God. In Protestant tradition and Catholic tradition, the first one is seen, you shall have no other gods beside me. Protestant tradition adds, you shall not succumb to idolatry. Catholic tradition divides the last one into two, where we would say, and Protestant tradition says, you shall not covet, and then gives a long list of what you're not supposed to covet. Catholic tradition says you're not supposed to covet everything, and you're also not supposed to covet your neighbor's wife. Yeah, well. So Moses was on Horeb before it was Sinai. Do you remember what he was doing there? He was probably following spiritual exercises given to him by the priest of Midian, Jethro. Moses had killed an Egyptian taskmaster. He fled because it became clear that the Pharaoh wanted him dead. And he fled to the mountains of Midian. He got friendly with the priest of Midian. He married one of his daughters, Zipporah, had a couple of sons. And Jethro was having him go out into the wilderness by himself. He would take the flocks, but for days he would be wandering in the silence of the wilderness. And one day he comes upon the burning bush, right? And he says, I'll turn aside to see this sight. Which means to me that probably that burning bush was there for untold other people, but they didn't turn aside. They just kept going. You know, how do you know when something has happened that's a call to you? I guess you know it because you listen. I guess if you hear, it's meant for you. So Moses approaches that some kind of brilliant light. Just a bush on fire doesn't quite do it. But it's a brilliant, powerful image. And he hears a voice. I'm among those who believes that God doesn't talk. I don't have a God who has a personality. Each of us has a personality, and we tend to project that out into the universe, but it's too little of a God. I don't think God talks, but I think people hear. And I think we hear according to the level of our consciousness. So we hear either ego messages or we hear more profound and more inclusive messages. Moses was told that he was to be active in going down and freeing a people enslaved in Egypt. And he said the obvious question, why me? And the obvious answer is, you turned aside. You're the one who's hearing. So he asks the voice he heard, when I go down and tell the people, who shall I say sent me? In other words, what's your name? Great question. The only time in tradition that God has ever asked, what's your name? And you know the answer. I mean, the text says, Moses heard, Ehyeh asher ehyeh, I am as I am. I am absolute singularity. I am identity that is absolutely inclusive. I am the universe opening its eye. I am that identity which holds everything and yet which is expressed, reflected in every one of you. Behind your eye is a greater eye. And behind that eye is a greater eye. Unlimited levels of transcendence. Unlimited levels of inclusivity. Unlimited levels of remembering. I am. Go down and tell them I am sent you. Great. Moses, incidentally, never said that to anybody. And he said it every time he spoke. Because the I am is the identity that's fuller, more inclusive, more powerful identity with which and from which a character like Moses spoke. The authority doesn't come from the ego self. The authority comes from a more inclusive I, a more inclusive identity. He didn't have to say who sent me, because it was clear from the energy that was flowing through him who it was who sent him. So what happened at Sinai? According to tradition, 3 months out, I'll say that again. According to tradition, 3 months out of Egypt, we're standing at Sinai. Moses has people prepare for 3 days. There's going to be a drama. Something big is going to happen. All the community knew it. We don't know how many people were around. You know, according to the biblical counting, there were over 2 million. Can you imagine? Without a loudspeaker system? I don't think so. So we don't know. We don't know how many, but whatever that community was like, they were preparing for something awesome. And in the 19th chapter of the book of Exodus, it describes the scene with the mountain starting to tremble. People felt a vibration. Energy is focusing there. There's clouds, there's lightning, and there's one sound. And you know what the sound is? The sound is of a shofar. I discovered in the first sentence, in the first service, that just saying the sound was a shofar didn't really help people very much. This is a shofar. A shofar is a ram's horn. And a ram's horn was the oldest of wind instruments in that part of the world. The conch shell was the oldest of wind instruments in another part of the world. This is a hollowed out ram's horn. The ram does need to be parted from the horn before you make this. It's hollowed out. Sometimes it's, well, not sometimes, all time it's soaked. It gets softer, so it can be twisted if it's not already twisted. There's some straight, there's some that are very ornate. This is my favorite shofar. A number of years ago, a friend from Los Angeles came up and said, "Finally, here's your shofar that you left in LA." I actually had never seen it before, but I didn't have the heart to tell him for 2 reasons. One reason was I didn't want him to feel like it was a trip in vain, and the other reason was I really liked it. We can't know how words were pronounced in those ancient days. You know, I know you'll be sad to hear this, but all the tape recordings of that time have been destroyed. However, the sound of the shofar is still the sound of the shofar. Because a shofar is made the same way it was always made. You can't put a metal mouthpiece on it. It's not kosher. You round out the mouthpiece a little bit. So I want to let you know what it sounded like. The text describes that sound growing in intensity. Actually, that's the sound. There is no other sound that's described. And then Moses goes on to say what he heard. So in December of 1969, my life in many ways was falling apart. My life kind of has a habit of doing that from time to time. Always painful periods, but often periods where new growing is about to emerge. So I left town. I was in Los Angeles. I left town and went to a growth center in Big Sur called Esalen. And I spent a couple weeks there just working with the teachers who were there. And one of the teachers was a very interesting fellow named Dr. John Lilly. Dr. John Lilly is of dolphin fame because he was working on communicating with dolphins. He's also of LSD fame. It may have been through LSD that he realized he could communicate with dolphins. That's when the dolphins were on LSD, you understand. And he was experimenting. He had a small group of us were lying on the floor of one of the houses at Esalen. It was actually Fritz Perl's house. I don't know if any of you remember. Fritz Perls originated modern Gestalt therapy, and he was still alive, although elderly at that time. We were lying on the living room floor, and he was playing big speakers, what then was considered a very high-tech sound system. And he asked us to lie down and close our eyes and listen. And there was a loud sound that maintained itself, and it sounded like a jet engine taking off, but steady, so it didn't get louder, didn't get softer, just stayed the same as it always was. And as I listened to it, I suddenly started hearing what he meant us to hear. And that was, behind the sound, there was an orchestra. And the orchestra was playing classical music. I was not at all a classical music buff at the time. I recognized it as a classical music piece, but I didn't know what it was. And I started hearing a classical guitar, like an acoustic guitar, playing in front of the orchestra, like the solo. And I remember being astonished at how the sound quality could be as exacting and as fine-tuned as what I was hearing. Even with that rushing sound, I could hear the orchestra and I could hear the guitar. I was impressed and I was curious. So I had a question to ask when that exercise was over. The sound stopped, everybody in the circle sat up, and we started sharing what we had heard. And the first person who shared didn't hear an orchestra. And I thought, wow. And the second person who shared also didn't hear an orchestra. And it started dawning on me that there was no orchestra. I created the orchestra that I perceived. I created that orchestra. John Lilly described the sound as pink noise. You know what white noise is? Pink noise has like all the colorations of sound in it, rather than white that has none. And it was the first time I realized enough to ask the question, how much of what I'm seeing and how much of what I'm hearing is out there, and how much of it is in here? And I realized I can't always tell, because I would have bet, I had no doubts that that orchestra and that guitar were in that recording. It didn't even dawn on me to even ask the question whether it was really there or not. It was there. You know that each of us puts together, for example, a visual reality that in fact doesn't exist. You know that each of us, in each of our eyes, there's a blind spot where the optic nerve connects. And there's that old experiment where you can draw two circles on a piece of paper and focus on one of them and draw the other until the other disappears because it hits that blind spot. That means we're looking at the world and there are holes in it. But our brain just constructs it right over. We don't even know where that hole is or was. Our reticular activating system at the base of the spine shuts out most of the sensory data that we receive. Harkening back to John Lilly, part of what the LSD experience does is it loosens up the reticular activating system, so all of a sudden one is aware of data, a stream of data that normally we close out. And synesthesia happens, so that means you're smelling tastes. You're seeing odors, instead of keeping everything in its place, the way the reticular activating system has. So, what was heard at Sinai? Well, it could have just been the sound of the shofar. Chapter 19 of Exodus says the sound got louder and louder. Maybe many shofars. And somebody like Moses heard what only he could hear. But one might say anybody could have heard it if we were available, if we were open to it. And what is it we're hearing from our world? And is it reflecting back to us the level of our consciousness? Or is it reflecting back to us the literal nature of the world? And if we strive to expand our own level of consciousness, will we start to hear different things and see different things in our environment and in our world? So what did Moses hear? He heard, I didn't finish the bush thing. At the bush, he asked God his name. I never said what the answer was, did I? Did I? Okay. Mark that down. I said that already. At Center for Spiritual Living, they used to do 3 services in the morning. And by the time I got to the 3rd service, my talk was a fraction of the length of the talk of the first and second, because every time I got to something, I thought I already said it. So the first thing Moses hears is, I am is the eternal being awakening within each one of you as your God. Awakening within each one of you as the spark of your being, the life of your being, the presence of your being. It's really the only positive principle. All the others flow from that. I am is one. The second, you can't have any others before me, because anything else splits, fragments our universe. Anything else is an expression of the ego that creates idols out of wealth, relationships, possessions, fame, all the things that all of us have a yearning for, but never quite satisfy the deeper yearnings of our souls. Idolatry just doesn't work. And then my favorite principle of all. My favorite principle is the third principle. You know what the third principle is? You guys should really read this thing called the Bible. The third principle says, normally translated, you shall not take the name of the Eternal One your God in vain, because God will not hold you guiltless if you take God's name in vain. When I grew up, and maybe when you grew up, that was defined as swearing. There's only one I am. There's no others. Don't swear. Don't swear before, don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery. Don't swear? I don't think so. Like, who do we think they were? The third principle says you cannot lift up, you cannot use the name of God and have nothing happen. That's what it says. What's the name of God? Yeah, I already gave you that hint. I am. We use the name of God more often and more consistently than we use any other name. We're using the name of God all the time. All the time. And every time we use it, it has impact. Nothing is more effective than using the name of God. Would have to be. We say, I am this, and we get convinced, and our universe demonstrates it for us, proves it to us. Each of us has the incredible responsibility to make choices about how we use the name of God. And you know as well as I do that part of our challenge is to utilize that name consciously. To utilize that name consciously in service of love, in service of compassion, in service of healing, of self and of other and of planet. We witness the times when we use the name of God with far less conscious intention. And we witness how there are those in our world who are utilizing the name of God to bring violence rather than healing. God gives us the responsibility. We get to use our I am in whatever way we use it. We have opportunities at each and every moment. So what I thought I'd do for the meditation is I'd start off with some sounds. we're all standing at the mountain all the time. Sinai is not an event. Any spiritual event like that is not an event that happens once. It's always happening. It's waiting for us to step into. So I'm going to make some sounds. The sounds meet us here after a trajectory of thousands of years. And the sounds now, just like the sounds then, are inviting us to hear more deeply. So following the sounds, there'll be silence. Within that silence, choose consciously. So please take a moment and close your eyes. And imagine a sound reaching through time. A sound reaching through us, connecting what we perceive as past to what we perceive as future. And I invite you to silently repeat these words. I am exactly where I am supposed to be. I am doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. I am with exactly the people I'm supposed to be with. I am exactly the one I am supposed to be. I am always here. I am here in love. And take a gentle breath and gently let your eyes open. So here's my image. You have two television sets, and you kind of angle them so that they're kind of facing each other. And on one, you put the channel MSNBC, and the other, you put the channel Fox News. And you let them yell at each other. And you witness that as a drama which it is very dangerous to get caught up in. And you practice opening your heart to contain both, and to find a way that acknowledges each and every one of us, that demands we see the dignity in each person, so that we no longer get fooled by the masks of personality we wear, and we speak to something deeper that is shared, like, go Hawks.